So thank you all for coming. My name is Jeff Wise, and my wife Susan and I live in Durango, Colorado. And I have been a artist, started with jewelry when I was 10 years old, making peace symbol rings for $3. This was in junior high school, making peace symbol rings for $3, and roach clips were $8. So I was a man of the times. But I've always had this passion for making things. And you could call it a compulsion, I guess. So I'm directing this urge in a positive way of just making objects. And really first started out making mobiles out of coat hangers and origami. And it's just progressed from there. So this is something I've done my whole life. And so we're just going to kind of take a bit of a journey here. And so this first piece that you see up on the screen is the Pink Pod Squad Car. And this was a pedal-powered sculpture that I made for the Burning Man Festival out in Nevada. And if you haven't heard of the Burning Man, it's an extraordinary experience. And we're kind of looking away from the festival here. If you looked back in the other direction, you would see this amazing city of about 60,000 people with these incredible structures and just a fantastic creation. And I like to tell people that really it's the easiest, cheapest way to leave the planet. So I highly recommend going to the Burning Man Festival. So I'm going to start out here, and so this first group of slides, the pieces all relate to each other, I think, in form. And so this next piece here is called Desert Vessel. And I like that word vessel because in English we have the meaning of a form of transportation and also of a container. And so I very much like to think of this piece. So this is a piece of jewelry, but I like to imagine this piece blown up to like 50 feet long, and I can see this thing much like the Pink Pod Squad Car as sort of hovering along the desert floor. So kind of the theme of this is talking about the shifting scale between jewelry and sculpture. And so that's kind of where we're going with this. So this structure here is actually the woodshed at our house. And again, you see that wonderful arched roof. This entire structure is made with concrete, and we're going to take a look here at how we built this piece. So started out laying up the kind of foundation formwork of it with cinder block, and I am a spectacularly bad carpenter, and so sculpture lends itself to my mindset because measuring is pretty much irrelevant. And I don't do things in plumb, and I don't do things in level. So we started out with this back wall of concrete block, and then it's got these little metal tabs laid up that'll be used to tie in the exterior shell of the poured concrete. And hanging in the middle is a manhole cover frame. I am a very avid customer of Belt Salvage and Scrap Metal Yard in Cortez, Colorado. So I like industrial cast-offs and detritus. So now we've laid up this board form, and between the wood and the cinder block is approximately a 6-inch void, and that'll ultimately have the concrete poured into it. I love this spectacular mess. So now we've poured the concrete, and you can see how you get this wonderful texture from the concrete. So here I am with my friend and assistant Jose Diaz, and so the roof of this piece it essentially functions like a suspension bridge almost. We started with the main rib that hung from the gable ends of the building, and the steel rod just formed this natural curve. And then from there we laid up the ribs of the roof and then put in the other rods to kind of form the curve. And then in between that we have, it's called shaker screen, which is basically used for at sand and gravel pits for sorting out different sizes of gravel. So here's another view. So on the back part of this, to support the roof, we welded pipe in, and that's how the back part is supported. But a really, really wonderful, elegant form to this. And then you can see the curving stairs in the front, and boy, the mums were putting on a nice show here too. So we live in Durango, Colorado. In the background are the kind of misty San Juan Mountains. And here we have an actual boat with Susan up front. That's my wife, Susan. This is in the Grand Canyon. Susan and I are avid boaters, and on this particular trip we had our own rubber raft, but Susan was hitching a ride with our friend Mary Ann, who's at the oars here in the wonderful Redbud Canyon. And Mary Ann actually built this boat, so this is a classic Grand Canyon dory. But I love this piece because it echoes the form of our woodshed. So kind of tying into the Grand Canyon, and of course the Grand Canyon has been inhabited by the Anasazi Indians from back around 400 AD. And the name of this brooch is called St. Peter's Kiva. And a kiva refers to a ceremonial chamber that the Anasazi would conduct their religious ceremonies in. It's an underground chamber, circular in form, and it has a special ceremonial opening to it. So that's the name of this piece. And this was somewhat conical in form. Right above the window there is kind of the high point of that cone, and this is all mosaic inlay with white coral. And this piece suggested to me a tool. The name of this is called Useful Object Number 2. I'm not exactly sure of its purpose, but I like, our work is very much has this feeling, very kind of ancient and yet very kind of science fiction sort of feeling to it. And the lapis element here, the dark blue, is a technique that I developed where along the bottom edge of that is a piece of metal and then each one of those little lapis blocks has a slot cut in it, and that slot fits over this piece of metal, and that's how I tie all those different elements together. And here we have another piece. This is called a spider's well, and kind of the juxtaposition between like a spider web and this well in the middle. Thanks to, it has a reminiscent of our Buckminster Fuller geodesic kind of aspect to it. So this is called Archangel Number 1, and in our booth here at the show we have Archangel Number 2. So I hope you'll come see us. Susan and I are represented by William Zimmer Gallery, and it's down at the opposite end of the show in booth number 202. And this is Lunar Cycle. Really wonderful piece. The main form of it has these ribs of small, narrow pieces of bronze wire, and it's all welded up. And then there's these kind of potato chip forms of chrome-plated bronze. And there's a central element there that I think of as the beating heart of this piece, which is out of carved wood. Another view. It's interesting to me how much this piece changes as you move around it, and that's for me a very important component of sculpture is what I call the horizon lines of the piece, the edges that they have this pleasing form to them. And for me, an effective, successful sculpture is one that really draws you around the piece, that you really take advantage of the three-dimensionality of it. So this is another photograph of some of the architectural landscaping that we've done at our house. And that part in the background is actually the front edge of a water cistern. And the gutter of the house drops into that cistern, and you can see the water going in these channels that are mounted on the side of that rock. And then that water at the bottom there is dropping into that pipe. And this is also another curved staircase. And that pipe then comes out into this lower cistern. So that cistern there, these wonderful objects, is actually kind of a bowl-shaped, about 4 foot in diameter, probably weighs around 1,200 pounds. And that's actually another piece of gravel crushing equipment. Those bowls kind of function like a mortar and pestle almost, and it's used for crushing gravel. So over the course of building these larger scale pieces, I have literally broken in half a 1-ton pickup truck, well, a flatbed truck that I built a cherry picker crane out of on the back. And so I've definitely hauled a lot of heavy stuff in my life. And Susan, she says, was one of the happiest days of her life when I broke Big Ugly in two, and they hauled it away to the dump. So I kind of like the cycle of that. I was getting all these pieces from the dump, and then my truck ended up there. So this is a kind of an overall view of our current house. In another slide or two, you'll see during our life we have built, well, I've actually built 3 houses. I initially, right out of high school, moved up into the mountains onto a friend's mining claim and built a small cabin way up in the mountains. So that was the first house I built. And then we've been working on this place for about 10 years. And so we just completed this house this last spring. And the column, it's a little difficult to see there, but you kind of see that central kind of Roman-looking column. The base of that actually has bulldozer gears stacked up on the bottom of it. And then that metal element in the foreground there is bulldozer tracks set on edge. And then in that concrete wall buttress there, you can see a metal gear on the left side of the stairs that's laid into the concrete. And those 2 wall elements there actually have about 250 tires in them. So that's how I achieved the volume for those walls. I had these stacks of tires filled with gravel, and then we built a form around that and poured concrete up around it. So here's a later picture now. With this early spring, we added this trellis element. So this was the first, or the second house that we built. That previous image was of our current house. So this house had more of a kind of craftsman influence to it, kind of Asian Southwest science fiction craft house, if you will, in that school. I couldn't find an image of it, but Susan and I did all the rock work on this place. And when we were doing all the rock work, the other side of the house is actually stone all the way up to the roof line. So when we were building this, we had our rock boneyard out in the driveway with thousands and thousands of rocks laid out in different shapes. Like we had our little triangles pile and our square pile, and so that whole project of doing the rock work on this took about 2 years. This was a commission I had. This was a pair of entrance columns, and we call these the Kachina Towers. A Kachina in the Hopi Indian tradition are ceremonial, spiritual guides. And so these two towers had, particularly the one on the right, very much has kind of a figurative aspect to it. And on the left, that form on the very top is actually a piece of glass. And apparently back in the 60s, Kerr, the K-E-R-R, the glass bottles, you know, the canning jars, had a factory out in Kansas. And sometime in the early 60s, they shut this factory down and they just dumped the furnaces full of glass out on the ground, something like 60 million pounds of glass in different colors. And so now people actually mine this glass. So it's this wonderful luminescent piece of glass. I think if I brought it to SOFA, I could probably get 50 grand for that thing. And so below that then are just found objects of metal. And then we built up you can see on the bottom left there, these walls are made out of screen with concrete incorporated into it. So here are a pair of sculptures. Both of these are kinetic in that the top elements are balanced and move around. The bases are both made with concrete. And in our booth we have a piece now similar in scale. These are about table lamp size. So in our booth we have a piece that I made with shells that I collected from Palm Beach last year. So I have to go back to Palm Beach because I'm running out of shells. So it'll be a tax deductible trip. And here are a pair of brooches. This is a form or structure that I use frequently, is creating these wire armatures. Incredibly graceful patterns to them. They're kind of suggestive of wood grain. And the piece on the left, again, has the white coral in it. And the piece on the right are actually shards from making arrowheads. Out in the desert, you'll, much more common than finding the actual arrowheads themselves, you'll find these shards of when the original Native Americans were creating their arrowheads, and this is sort of the scrap for making the arrowheads. But this beautiful, rich red color, really wonderful stone. And both of these pins, the bottom element are screw clasps, so you unscrew those elements on the bottom to open and close the clasp. And I really enjoy the mechanical aspect of jewelry and sculpture of how to attach things together and fit things and to make them work. So I really, really enjoy that process. Here's Susan levitating out in the desert. This is Susan and her cousin Leslie. This is a place, that wall in the background is about 1,500 feet high. And that section that you can see is almost a mile long. This is in Canyonlands National Park, a place called Island in the Sky. And just an astounding place. And we've been out there probably 20 different times. And we take this wonderful bike trip that's about 100 miles long, which sounds somewhat arduous, but it's compensated by the fact that it's an old uranium jeep mining road. And so we take a truck with us loaded up with coolers full of wine and goodies. Makes our desert experience quite luxurious. So here are a couple of necklaces.
Jeff, the question was given as to how did that picture of the flying people.
That's Photoshop. And actually, so we had an artist friend, Steve Midget, that actually he went on that trip with us, and he did all these crazy things with these images from the trip, and that was probably about 10 years ago. And when I saw these images, it was like, how did you do that? I mean, so now it's fairly common to be able to manipulate that stuff, but it's amazing how technology is just roaring along. And really our jewelry and the sculpture, I do kind of an old school, using kind of traditional tools and things like that. Now a thing that has come along is a machine called a laser welder, which is a miniature welder that can, and it's used in jewelry applications. And like with those wire armatures that I was making, where each individual joint, like in those two brooches, there's hundreds and hundreds of individual solder attachments where every wire crosses another support wire. And now with a laser welder, you can do these things very simply and quickly. But I am quite adept at doing this miniature soldering quickly, and I suppose it's like John Henry and the steam drill. I'm out there with my sledgehammer doing this stuff, and going up against the steam drill. So it's sort of the analogy of old technology and new technology. So that piece on the right, that speckled round piece in the middle, is Montana agate. And I just love Montana agate, really wonderful. And it's a neat it's found in the bed of the Yellowstone River up in Montana. And in the fall, when the water's low, the prospectors have mining claims based on how many feet of the river. And so in the fall, they go out and gather these stones. So here are a couple of blue pieces. The one on the left is called Aztec lily pads. And so both of these are with lapis lazuli. And the element on the left has a very kind of Asian motif to it. And the piece on the right, that bottom element, is mosaic of lapis lazuli blocks. And that entire thing is completely flexible. It's basically like and we have another piece that's similar to this in the booth, which it's kind of like a chainmail on the back, and so each block is on its own little individual mounting. So that whole bottom element is very much like fabric. And a couple of rings. The piece on the left is called the Night Sky. And then the one on the right, each of those cones is an individual floating element, and then all the cones spin around on a central axis. So it's very much of a kinetic ring. Yeah, it's a really cool piece. It has this wonderful textural quality to it with the movement, and yeah, and that's a very, both of those are very sculptural in their sensibility. So now this is my figurative sculpture, and this piece is done in bronze, carved originally in clay, and this is called Cabeza de la Luna, or a moon head. And this piece is quite small, around the size of a grapefruit, but I would love to do this thing about 6 foot tall. It would really, really be cool, kind of like an Olmec head. So that would be a project that I would love to do sometime, is to do this in really large scale. And this piece is called Human/Nature. And so this fellow is holding a saw, and he has this wonderful tree growing out of his chest, but he's contemplating harvesting himself, in effect. And so he's at a bit of a crossroads here. I'm not sure what he's gonna do. A little grim, perhaps, but I think it's analogous of what we seem to be doing, is kind of consuming ourselves, consuming our planet. So he has on his Oxford shoes there to kind of suggest the corporate mindset. But I like to think he's going to come to his senses and pull up. So this piece is called Movamundo, and these are two different views. And I think she really beautifully illustrates this sense of a sculpture offering very different aspects to itself as you move around the piece. And it's actually fairly large. It's over 3 feet tall. And the next slide, you'll see that the original of this piece was actually carved in marble, in this beautiful white marble. And this is kind of where I started sculpting. Was there's a town named Marble, Colorado, which is just over the Elk Mountains from Aspen, and it's an entire mountain of white marble. And back in the starting around the 1880s, they started this marble quarry, and it's actually an underground quarry where at this point now they have, and I've been in the chamber. The mine pretty much shut down back in the 20s. They still do some mining on a very small scale, but the inner chamber is really astounding, and you could easily fit, I don't know, 3 giant cathedrals in this space. So it's really a breathtaking place to be. But the Denver Art Students League got a lease to, they have a site outside of the mine, and every summer they have a marble carving workshop, and it's really terrific because all the artists just camp out in the woods, and we have communal dining, and it's like summer camp. It's really a terrific experience. And then they have these giant air compressors going for everybody to, we use a lot of pneumatic power tools, chisels and things like that. So we make a hell of a lot of noise, and everybody gets covered with dust, and it's just a great experience. But that's where I first started doing this sculpture. So this piece was made about 20 years ago. But Movamundo, to me, she's evocative of like a seed or an ovum, and she has this kind of fish-like quality and a human quality to her. And then this spiral coming out of her mind, it spirals around, and you can see the little flotus, or the fetus, the floating fetus there on the umbilical cord, floating inside of her. So there's the original, and I love how her little iris babies are growing there, this wonderful little school of white iris flowers. So she's parked in the garden in the back of our house. Our house is built around these giant boulders. Oh, and this, so this was, Maquette is the name of a sculpture magazine, and I got to be on the cover. You can see my fabulous yellow rubber shoes. I went through like 6 pair of those things. Susan was getting really tired of these. She was glad when the company stopped making those and I had to give up my yellow rubber shoe fetish. But somebody gave me this yellow rubber duck-billed platypus. That's what's hanging around my neck there. So, but here you can see at the Marble Symposium, and we each have like a covered tent. And I've brushed most of the marble dust off, but so this piece is called Standing Taurus. This is about 24 inches tall. And the top element is wood. And this is a brooch, spatial container. And the wonderful thing with these wire armatures is you get what's called a moire effect, where when you have one screen in front of another, as you move around it, you get that kind of diffusion pattern that happens, and it creates this a wonderful sense of motion and movement to it. And we carved that kind of cup-shaped form. And this is called seed pod. So the lapis pieces, each one of those is actually floating on a little stalk of gold wire independently. And so that lapis form is somewhat dome-shaped. And again, we've carved these stones ourselves. Susan took a wonderful workshop from an artist, a Canadian artist, Charles Luton Brain, who invented this metalworking technique called fold forming. And that piece on the left is fold formed. And basically you take sheets of metal and fold them in different shapes and then kind of pound along the fold lines to create this kind of sharp edge, and then you open it up again. And it's really a wonderful technique. And then we carved the chalcedony elements on the top, which are very fluid. And this is a big sculptural bracelet. So here we have a sculpture. I like the name of this piece. This is called The Gravity of Clouds. And that name is very much suggestive of what I like to do with sculpture, which is essentially to make rocks that fly. So that top element is a balanced arm, and it spins around, and then the element on the right is another balanced piece. And it has 3 kind of potato chip shapes out of wood. And this piece feels very much kind of like a Mayan stela. I can't remember the name of this right now, but the top elements are all those individual wands that are balanced there, and so it very, very much feels like the wind passing through this thing. And then the middle area is actually a hole that I burned through the wood and then rubbed with red pigment, so to suggest this really kind of glowing aspect to it. but that central part, you see the charred wood in it. So, and this piece is really kind of the closest, kind of suggestive of Alexander Calder's work. And Alexander Calder, of course, was a towering figure in sculpture, and he's really the birthplace of mobile sculpture. But it's a bit of a curse, because any moving sculpture that people see, they immediately associate with Calder. And so although Alexander Calder started the idea of the mobile, there's just a million different ways to incorporate that motion. But I love this with the kind of ghost-like patterns of the birds flying through it. And again, we've got the rock balancing on the left. So, and this is my last image, and this is called Genesis Theory. And again, it's a moving piece. That central rod rotates. But here we have the hand of creation, and kind of formed out of the gaseous plasma of space, creating the universe. And this piece is about 4 feet tall. And we end with Susan and I back out in the desert, standing under the Duckhead Man. These amazing, fantastic forms, these petroglyphs that have been carved into the rock. Just really astounding, magical forms. And so this is where Susan and I, this is our place of refuge. So thank you very much. That's my presentation.